everyone, and welcome back to this week's session of our Cup of Joy Embroider-along. We're excited to have you back, and we're going to just jump right in with this week's blocks. This week we're going to learn some different embellishment techniques that can be done to give you kind of a dimensional look or some additional sparkle. So this week for your blocks, we're going to work with Fringe while we create the snowman block. We're going to learn about Mylar Applique when we do the steam block. We're going to make the first of our freestanding embellishments for the Advent portion of the quilt, which will be the 3 stockings. We will then also look at quilting the filler blocks. And if you remember back in the prep, we cut some plain squares of different prints that were labeled filler. Now, because we are quilting the blocks in the hoop, we also need to quilt these filler blocks. So if you are not quilting this quilt in the hoop as you go along, you do not need to quilt the filler blocks. We've broken the filler blocks down into each section, well, Kimberbell has, and we're just going to take one section a week and quilt those filler blocks. So you only need to do that if you are quilting in the hoop. We're going to look first at making fringe with our snowman. The tassels and the scarf ends of our snowman contain fringe, and we're going to basically stitch some large satin stitches, and then we're going to cut the bobbin thread and pull out the loops to give us kind of a furry look. The snowman gets trimmed to 6.5 by 8.5, so therefore he needs a larger hoop, something along the lines of a 7 by 9 embroidery field if you are quilting in the hoop. So in the world of BERNINA, that's going to be a maxi hoop for our project. And the embroidery design and the quilting design are centered on top of each other. So the snowman calls for the 6 by 8 cup quilting design. You can see that when we open it, the system puts it into a maxi. We're going to add the snowman to it. And since we didn't move the quilting design, as soon as we add the snowman, he is centered in the hoop and centered on top of the quilting. So anytime you open a design on the BERNINA, it always centers everything to the hoop. Now, this particular block here is going to start out just like our blocks last week did. We're going to quilt the same way. We are going to trim in place applique the snowman, its body, his hat. We are then going to stitch his eyes, his nose, and then his arms. Okay, so this is nothing different than we haven't done already. After his arms are stitched, we need to make a decision about bobbin thread. Fringe can be done with either a contrasting color of bobbin thread or with wash away thread. Okay, it's your choice as to which one you use. Wash away is not at all required. I think this particular design would be fine and easy to create the fringe with a contrast color. I have done the scarf fringe already in a contrast color bobbin. So you can see my bobbin is that goldish color. And I'm going to stitch the hat fringe with a water-soluble bobbin. Okay, so the water-soluble thread can be any brand. I use Wonderfil's Rinse and Gone, excuse me, not Iron Infused, Rinse and Gone. So I wind this on my bobbin, and then you want to make sure that that bobbin gets back into a baggie labeled wash away as soon as you're finished, because we don't want to accidentally pick up this bobbin okay, because it looks like white thread, and use it for piecing or construction, because the first time the project is washed, everything is going to fall apart, and we don't want that to happen. Okay, so I already went ahead and did the beginning steps of this. Now we're going to go over to the machine here. We're going to stitch the hat tassels with wash away in my bobbin and the color I want my tassels in the needle. Now, once your 2 sections of fringe are complete, you want to take and put your bobbin back to your regular embroidery thread. Okay, so I have, just for this purpose, to show you, I have wash away thread on my hat, I have contrasting bobbin on my scarf, and I'll show you how to make those into fringe after the design is completely finished. Do not do anything with those until this design is done. Once you've gone back to regular bobbin thread, we are going to work through the remainder of the design. You're going to cover stitch your hat. You're going to stitch your scarf. We have the little green stripe on the end of the scarf, the little white snowflakes. We have a placement line for a small Velcro dot with the smooth side, and then we'll tack that down, and then we'll run the advent calendar number. Okay, so we're going to return to the machine, and we're going to work through all of these color stops until the design is complete, and then we will work on creating the fringe. Now, when your snowman is complete, I would leave him in the hoop while you take care of the fringe, okay? Excuse me. I wouldn't take it out of the hoop. It's just nice to be taught like it is. We are going to, I'm going to do the contrasting color bobbin first, okay? So I'm going to turn it over to the back side of the hoop here. Let me zoom in a little more. And you can see the goldy color bobbin that I have right there. I'm going to take a pair of scissors and I'm going to cut the gold colored bobbin. Okay, just going to get my scissors in there. You can even take a seam ripper. You just don't want to cut the fabric or the stabilizer. We just want the thread cut. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and cut this one. You want to cut the one on the end. Do not cut the green. The green is not fringe. Okay, so once that is cut, you would turn the hoop back over. You can take a pair of tweezers. I like to take my stiletto and just slide it inside of there and pull those loops up. May take a little bit of wiggling. Pull out any bobbin thread that you see. Kind of may have come up with it. And that will give you your fringe here. Now, if you used water-soluble bobbin, I'm going to take some water and a paintbrush. You can use a Q-tip. And I'm just going to wet that bobbin. Okay. So that we can get that bobbin thread to dissolve. Just going to do the same technique. You may find that you have to kind of rinse the ends. There's our fringe. Okay, we're going to take him out of the hoop. He's going to be trimmed to a 6.5 by 8.5 inch rectangle. Center my orange pop in the middle there. Drop the next size up. And there's our snowman. Isn't he just adorable? The next block that we're going to stitch is the steam block. This block is going to fit inside our medium hoop. The embroidery design is going to be centered over top of the 2x4 vertical line quilt design. And we are going to manually trim this block up to a 2.5 by 4.5 because we don't have an orange pop ruler of that size. So we'll use the fabric placement and tack down lines to trim to the appropriate size. The Mylar you can find inside of your embellishment kit. He looks like this shiny clear piece. Okay, so you want to find that. I'm going to quilt, for me, I'm going to quilt in gray, and I'm going to do the remainder of the design in white thread. So once my quilting is finished, I'm going to change my upper thread to white, and we're going to finish the design. Now, if you are quilting in the hoop, we will do all the same steps that we've done before and do our quilting. The thing to note about the steam embroidery design is that the first two color stops of the steam embroidery design we do not need if we are quilting in the hoop. So if we've already quilted the block, we can skip the first two color stops of the steam design. Okay, those are fabric placement and tack down lines, which we don't need because our fabric N is already in place. If you are not quilting in the hoop, you will need to run the first color stop, which is going to be this box. You will then place your fabric right side up, completely covering that box, tape it in place, and then run the next color stop, which will tack it down. Okay, make sure you've also placed your fabric right side up. I'm going to work in white thread, and the first color stop I'm going to do is the color stop 8. That's if you have combined designs, it will be color stop 3 if you are just doing embroidery. And we're going to run a placement line directly into our background. Once your placement line is stitched, you're going to take your piece of Mylar and you're going to completely cover that placement line. I'm going to return it to the machine. I am going to put a little tape at the top and the bottom, making sure that tape is outside of anywhere that it's actually going to stitch. once your design has finished, or that color stop is finished, this is what you will have. Here, let's zoom in. So you're going to have this filled in steam piece. We need to remove the excess Mylar from around the edge. Now, what's nice is the Mylar pretty much just tears away. Okay, so you can just come in with your fingers and tear away around the edge. If you have any sections on the inside here, you can use your tweezers to grab a hold of any of that on the inside. I'm going to return the hoop to the machine, and we're going to run the final color stop. Okay, that's going to put a satin stitch around the edge of this steam. When your design is finished, we're going to remove him from the hoop and we will trim him to size. He is going to be trimmed to 2.5 by 4.5, which should be these lines, the outer lines that are holding down your block. Now, before you immediately go and cut on those lines, I would suggest measuring to make sure that those lines are, it's a little bit, for me, a little bit above and below the top and bottom, but I just want to make sure that it measures 2.5 by 4.5 when we are finished. And there is your steam block. We just have one of those, and then we'll move on to our next block, which is stitching our advent stockings. The next pieces that we're going to make are the advent stockings that will get attached to the quilt on their particular days. These are freestanding embellishments, so we're going to be using wash away stabilizer in the hoop. Now, you can make one stocking at a time, and if so, you can use the medium hoop, or you can combine all 3 designs into one hooping, and you can use either the mega or the maxi hoop. So I'm going to show you how I combined all of the designs. So I'm just going to open one of the designs. I'm going to change my hoop to the mega. The mega is the smallest hoop possible to fit all 3, and the maxi would be a little bit bigger. So I have a mega hoop selected. I'm going to rotate this stocking. So I'm going to go up under the information screen, and I'm going to rotate him 90 degrees so that he is laying down on his side, and then I'm going to move him up towards the top. Okay. I'm going to add a design to this. I'm going to pick the next one, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to rotate him 90 degrees, and we'll leave him, move him towards the bottom. And then again, we're going to add the third design, rotate him, and leave him in the center. So that's how we're going to do the 3, I'm going to do the 3 stockings. Feel free to do them all in one hooping, individually or in one hooping. The steps are the same. We're just going to work through one stocking at a time. It just saves me from having to rehoop. It really, either way works. Now, with the stockings, each stocking needs a piece of foam, 2 3.5 by 6 pieces of the white felt. This is going to be the base and then the back of the stocking. And then we need the color of the stocking, which is a 3 by 4.5. You have a red one, a seafoam green, and then there is a gray one. And then we need the cuff piece, which is the white with the little polka dot. It's 3 by 2.5. And to the back of the cuff fabric, you're going to apply a piece of fusible woven. Okay. All right. We're going to make the first stocking, and feel free to make them any color that you would like. Okay. They don't need to be, 14 doesn't need to be the aqua one. It could be the red one. It's completely up to you. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to stitch the placement line so that we know where to place our foam. I'm going to do this in all white thread. Now, if you were comfortable, you could skip ahead in the design and stitch the placement line for all 3 stockings and then tack all of the foam down at once and then trim it. I'm not going to do that here. So I have my placement line that's stitched. I'm going to take my piece of foam. I'm going to lay it over top of that placement line, and we're going to tack it in place. Now once this is tacked in place, I'm going to pull the hoop off the machine. I'm going to place it on a nice flat surface, and I'm going to use the scissors of my choice to trim the excess foam away from the edge as close to the stitching line as I can. Once your stocking foam is trimmed in place here as close to the edge, we're going to return the hoop to the machine, and we're going to lay the base felt. So there is a placement line you can stitch. You can also skip this placement line because I think you have an idea as to where you're going to place the felt. I am going to stitch it right now so that you can see it. Let's see, there's the placement line. We're going to take one piece of felt. We're going to lay it on top of covering all of that placement line. I am going to put a piece of tape there to hold it top and bottom. Do not trim this white felt. Leave it just like it is. We'll trim it once we get it out of the hoop. This line that it just stitched is actually our cut line for when we do get our stocking finished. The next color stop is going to stitch the placement line for our belt, the actual color of our stocking. I am going to suggest at this point that you change your thread to the thread color that you plan to tack your stocking down in. There is no decorative stitch covering the edge of this stocking, so this thread could show, so we don't want to use contrasting. Okay, my thread is changed, and I'm going to stitch the placement line so I know where to put this, but again, it's a pretty big piece, and I think it's pretty obvious as to where it goes. Okay. There's the placement line. I'm going to take my piece of colored felt. I'm going to place it over top of that placement line, making sure that everything is attached, or excuse me, everything is covered. And then we're going to tack this in place. That has been tacked in place. We're going to trim just the colored felt away from that line. Now remember, that's not going to get covered, so you want to make sure that you do, this nicely. We're going to return this to the machine. We are going to change the upper thread back to white, and we're going to work through the steps of stitching down the cuff fabric. So there's a placement line. We're going to then lay our fabric right side up, covering all of that placement line. We will then tack the fabric down, we will trim it, and then we'll run the cover stitch for that design. Now once your cuff is decorative stitched and covered, we're going to stitch the number in the center of our stocking. When your number is finished, we're going to take the hoop off the machine. We're going to turn it over to the wrong side. We're going to take the other piece of felt and we're going to tape it to the back. We will then return this hoop to the machine and we're going to stitch the final color stop of this stocking, which is going to stitch the outside line, that red thread off of there, and basically restitch this line holding the backing on to our project. When that line is stitched, your backing will be nicely tacked on. Now if you did this in a single hooping, one stocking and one hooping, you can go ahead and take this out of the hoop if you like. We're going to be cutting on the, so this was the line it just stitched. This was the very first line that it stitched, and tack this down. You're going to be cutting right on that outer line, okay? So do not cut from the wrong side because this is not the line you want to be cutting. It's actually the outer line that only shows in the top felt, okay? I'm going to leave that there. I'm going to return my hoop to the machine and I'm going to continue stitching the other two stockings before I take this out. Now that all three of my stockings are finished, I'm going to take my hoop off the machine here. We're going to come over, we're going to remove the items from the hoop, and we're going to trim. Now, this is water-soluble stabilizer that's in here. I am not going to worry about getting all the stabilizer off of the entire project, okay? So once you cut this, if you want to take, if you can see the water-soluble stabilizer and it, I don't know, bothers you or just sticks out or is pretty obvious, you can take that paintbrush like we did with the fringe, and you can wet and go around the edge and remove the stabilizer. Again, we're not cutting on the inner line, we're cutting right on the outer line. I'm not doing it from the back side because this is the line we want to keep. I'm just going to trim my thread tails. And you can pull away any of the fuzzies, the threads or the stitches that were left. You can get your and you'll be left with these little baby stockings. Okay, and we're going to repeat this with the other two as well. All three stockings are trimmed, and again, I really can't see that white stabilizer, that white wash away in the middle, but if you wanted, you could take your paintbrush or a Q-tip with water and work your way around trimming or dissolving that stabilizer for your stockings. But I am happy with the way that they are. And I'm not going to do any trimming, except I still see one thread. Next, and the final step for today is going to be quilting the filler blocks. So let's take a look at what is needed for quilting the filler blocks. Now, quilting the filler blocks is going to be different than the way that we quilt when we are going to put an embroidery design. The hoop size is going to depend upon the size of your filler block, and we are going to be centering the quilting inside that particular block. The blocks are not trimmed. Remember, we've already cut the blocks to the size that we need. So we're not trimming anything after we're quilting, we're just removing the excess stabilizer. So on page 61, you will see the chart for each section, and this is section 1's chart. So the unit up top labeled number 1 is going to get the tree, the 2x8 vertical tree quilt design. And then section 2 is going to get the plant 2x4 design, and so on and so forth. So they look just like this. Now, we are going to need to do some sewing before we can quilt this, okay? So units 1 and 2 are those 2.5-inch squares that we're going to need to sew together into one long unit. So you can see these need to be pieced together prior to quilting. Okay. Just the pieces in 1 and 2. So 1 has 4 squares and 2 has 2 squares. 3, 4, 5, and 6 will all be done individually. So this uses the second technique, okay? This is how we do it when there is no additional embroidery that will be put on top of the block, okay? We're gonna hoop the same mesh cutaway. We're gonna work through stitching the batting line, place our batting, tack it down, and trim. Now, if you want to skip the batting, tack down, and trim steps, you could cut your batting to the finished size of the block and place it inside the placement line. Okay, and I'll show you that. And then you can skip the fabric placement line. We're going to place the background fabric right side up, matching the edge of the fabric with the stitched line. We're going to tape all 4 sides. And since we're taping it down, we don't need to stitch the tack down. And then we're going to quilt the background stitch, or quilt the quilting stitch. And if you've opted to skip the batting tack down, make sure that your batting doesn't move when we place our batting in and our backing on top of it. Okay? So I'm going to go back here. I'm going to start with number 4, okay? Just because it's one single block, it can be fairly quick here. I can show you the technique, and then I'll talk about additional ones. So number 4 is going to use the winter 2x2 design. So we're going to open up the winter 2x2 design, which will fit inside of the medium hoop. Okay, so we're going to come over to the machine. I'm going to open my design over here. I'm going to put my hoop on the machine. So I have my medium hoop. I have lightweight mesh in the hoop. I am going to take this block and I'm going to quilt it in white thread. I'm going to run the placement line so I know where to put this piece of batting. All right, I've stitched my placement line for my batting. Now, before I place my batting down, if you're going to place a piece of batting and trim it, you're just going to take your batting, place it in there, and then run color stop 2, which is going to tack this in place, and then you can trim it. If you want to pre-cut your batting to size, We're going to run the first color stop, which is going to give you your placement line. We're going to skip the batting tack down, and then we're going to run the fabric placement line. Okay, so we'll have 2 placement lines inside of this hoop. So now that there is 1 placement line on the inside, that's my batting, and the outer one's my fabric. I'm going to take my batting that I have pre-cut to this size. Okay, and what size do you know to pre-cut it to? Well, we're cutting it to the finished size of our block. And so if this block is a 2.5, once this was sewn in, it would be 2 inches finished. So I'm going to cut a 2-inch piece of batting. I'm going to put him right there in the center. If you are concerned about him moving while you are placing your fabric, you can get a little glue stick, put a little washable glue stick on the back of that batting, kind of stick it in place. The glue sticks that you use for English paper piecing would be just fine. We're going to then place our fabric right side up, covering that batting and matching the edge of the fabric to the fabric placement line. I am going to tape this in place just on the edge. Okay, I don't want to have to be picking too much of this out of my seam allowance, or not seam allowance, too much out of my quilting. And then I'm going to skip the next color stop, which would tack down the fabric, which is we don't need because there is no fabric to tack down since this is cut to size. Okay. All 4 sides are taped, and now I'm going to quilt the background quilt design. Design is finished, so we will carefully remove the tape from the edges. You can take your project out of the hoop, and let's take a look at the block 3, which is the blue block here, which is going to use the lines quilting, the 4x4 vertical design. This is going to fit inside of the small clamp hoop. So if you have a small clamp hoop, you can use that. Otherwise, this design will need to go into a large oval. So I have my small clamp hoop. I'm going to open up the 4x4 lines vertical quilting. I'm going to run my placement line, and this time I'm going to leave my batting oversized so that we can walk through all the same steps. So this square is a 4.5-inch square. I have a piece of batting that's like a 5-inch square. I'm going to lay it over top of that batting placement line that it just stitched, and then I'm going to run the tack down. Once our batting is in place, we're going to trim up the excess batting from around the edge. As close to the stitching line as possible. You can take the hoop off the machine. Okay, so my batting is trimmed. I'm going to run the next color stop, which is going to stitch me a placement line. So I know exactly where to put my fabric because I want to make sure it stays centered. The quilting design stays where it needs. You can see there is our fabric placement line. I'm going to take my fabric I'm going to line it up with that placement line. The purpose of this taping is not only to keep this in place, but also to minimize the pull when we stitch the background quilting. Okay. All right, that's all taped in place. I'm going to change my threads to blue. I'm going to quilt this one in blue, but you feel free, you could quilt all your filler blocks in the same color if you wanted. I'm going to skip the fabric placement line. I'm going to skip color stop 4, and we're going to quilt the quilt design. Now our square is quilted. Let's take a look at the units. 5 and 6 are going to be done the same way. Okay, so they'll operate in the same manner of placement line, tack your batting down, everything that we just did with the blue one, you could do with the rectangles 5 and 6. However, I like to save stabilizer, okay? And if I were to do number 5, which is a 2 by 6, 5 is plant, 3, 2 by 6. I have to fill this entire hoop with stabilizer, and I'm only going to be stitching down the middle, okay? I have 2 by 6 designs to do. So we have both 5 and 6 are done as a 2 by 6. 5 is this design, and unit 6 is a tree. Excuse me. That if I put in here, they just fit in here. Okay, so I can slide them just so they just fit. None of the designs are overlapping in that hoop. If that's a little too close for comfort, you can choose the midi hoop. And the midi hoop, you can then spread them just a tad apart. And then stitch. So now I'm only using one midi hooping of stabilizer versus 2 large ovals. For me, it's maximizing the amount of stabilizer, okay? The same goes for stitching the units for 1 and 2, okay? So on here, Unit 1 uses the 2 by 8 tree. Okay, so I'm going to go to a midi hoop because I can already tell it's going to need it. Because at 2 by 8, I can't put anything in a large oval. I can't move it left or right. And then we're going to add Unit 2, which is the 2 by 4 plant design, to it. And now I have that in 1 midi hooping. And I'm going to work through the same steps. I'm going to go through and I'm going to quilt and place the batting and quilt everything for 1 rectangle, and then I'm going to repeat the process for the second, just maximizing the space for my stabilizer. The first one that, here we go. The first one that it's going to stitch is the tree, which is the 2 by 8, which is what is going to be used in the 4 unit piece. I'm going to quilt this in white. So I'm going to thread my machine in white, and we're going to run the batting placement line. Batting placement line is there. Place my batting on top of. I'm going to tack my batting down. Once my batting is tacked in place, I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to trim the excess batting. Stitch my fabric placement line. Line. Place my fabric down. Skip. Quilt. Okay, that design is finished, and now I'm going to work through the steps on the other design. Now on this one, I'm going to cut my batting to size just so you can see them right next to each other. So I'm going to skip the batting tack down and stitch the fabric placement. My pre-cut batting on the inside line, my fabric to the outside line, skip, quilt. Is our two-pieced units quilted. I'm going to take them out of the hoop, I'm going to reload, and I'm going to quilt basically units 5 and 6 in this same hoop. Those are your quilted filler blocks. Now, just a note about when trimming the quilted filler blocks. On the back of the design, you'll remember that we stitched a line for the placement and a line for the placement of the batting, and then a line for the placement of the fabric. When you trim up these blocks, we need to make sure that they measure the exact size that they need to be so that they'll fit in the quilt where we need it to fit. So when I'm trimming quilted filler blocks, I like to do so from the wrong side, and I'm going to measure that placement line. Okay, so that outside placement line to outside placement line, and that's what I'm going to use to cut. I need them to measure everything today is a 2.5 inch square except for this, which should measure a 4.5 when it's done. And then in terms of length, you have 2.5 square, 2.5 by 4.5, 2.5 by 6.5, 2.5 by 8.5, and like I said, a 4.5 inch square. But I use these lines to make sure when I measure from them that they are the size they're supposed to be. When you're trimming, if you find that in order to get it to be the measurement, you may have to have a little bit of stabilizer with no fabric, it's okay. As long as it's not more than an 1/8 of an inch, you'll catch this in the seam allowance. So it's not a huge deal. It just means that we need to tape down more, okay, when you're quilting, because that just pulled in just a little bit. So those are all your quilted filler blocks that you'll need for section 1. I'd go ahead and I would put them back in a baggie that you have labeled section 1. And this week we are finished. So you have your quilted fillers, you have your 3 stockings, you have your steam for your hot cup of cocoa, and then we have our adorable little fringy snowman. Now, if you have any questions, please be sure to comment down here below, and I will gladly answer or get back to you with an answer on that. Be sure that you like and subscribe here to our YouTube channel, and I look forward to seeing you back here next week, October 4th, same time, to start stitching the next set of blocks. Have a great week, everyone, and happy stitching.